has come to be regarded as the final reality. And the problems that arise around us have precedence over the pressures that arise within us. If, therefore, as a result of tradition, heredity, indoctrination, and experience, each of these to a measure misunderstood, we arrive at a certain conclusion or a certain attitude, we may develop a total personality which is psychologically unsound. This personality may not be so considered either by the individual or by his associates, because he may live in a world in which this kind of unsoundness is prevalent. Most people being like himself, he considers his own nature to be normal. And in this sense of normalcy, he goes on breaking rules and laws imposed by nature because others break these rules and laws. And so society becomes an order of lawbreakers rather than of law keepers. Such laws as will bring with them immediate physical punishment we are inclined to keep. But laws which affect us primarily on a psychic level, we neither understand nor appreciate, nor do we sense the need to obey them. This means, substantially, that the inner life of man may not condone his outer conduct, be entirely sympathetic with it, or recognize it as a best way of action. To meet this situation, man builds more and more rational defenses. He tries to convince himself. He psychologizes himself, or permits himself to fall under the hypnosis of prevalent attitudes. Now, hypnosis produces a susceptibility to suggestion. The hypnotized person must, to a measure, temporarily fulfill the wishes of the hypnotist. In the same way, a hypnotized society must fulfill the pressures or purposes or accepted procedures of that society. Once we assume the normalcy of a social pattern, this social pattern begins to influence us. It moves in upon us. It requires allegiance. It creates penetration by consistent repetition of its plan or its procedure. And today we take the child from its parent's knee, place it into the school. The school continues to indoctrinate that child with certain beliefs. These beliefs are carried through into higher education. They then proceed onto the business level of life. Then the individual marries someone with the same belief. These are further intensified. The young people become parents and pass on these same beliefs to their children. And all the time, these beliefs are becoming more believed by the person who holds them. After a time, it seems that there is no other way, that there could not possibly be any justifiable conflict, that these things with which we have hypnotized ourselves have to be true, that they are the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And having taken this oath on the witness stand, we proceed to lie ourselves out of faith. We don't always intend to, but our witnesses under oath do not agree in their evidence. And the mere fact that we are even trying to be truthful does not help too much after we have forgotten how to be truthful. We are at a disadvantage all the way along. Thus we may build up two distinct levels of psychic entities. The outer level is dependent almost entirely upon outward circumstances, and it produces a more or less complete psychic being, created to obey the impressions and pressures around it. From this psychic being comes this kind of static drag that has been noted throughout human society. It causes the traditionalist. It causes the person who resists change, the dogmatist and the exclusionist. It causes the reactionary and impels persons in various walks of life to lock their own ways away from other people. It leads to legislations to protect entrenchment rather than progress. And all through this procedure, everyone is doing what he believes to be right, but he does not know what right actually means. Now, he can go along like this, making a very choice, cultivated group of mistakes. He can go on breaking one natural law after another. And if his infringements are not too massive, he is very likely to drift through the years with only those general discomforts and inconveniences which he can blame on someone else. But actually, he is not living well. He is not being true to the rules of his own existence. He is betraying something inside of him while he is trying to protect the surface of his own consciousness. This situation frequently leads to the building up of pressure. The variations of the personality from the inner integration of life may become more pronounced. Attitudes that are detrimental may take over. The individual may find himself inundated in his fears and worries. He may find his natural optimism ebbing away. He may discover that his health is vanishing by degrees, and that he has not much longer to go before the general error of his ways will result in the disintegration of his mortal compound. This situation can and often does result in a desperate effort or a meaningful effort on the part of the archetypal consciousness to reassert itself over the life of this individual. I think we are safe in saying that while man, by himself in a forest, could not necessarily learn to read and write, that in this state of isolation, had he the proper faculties, he could gain a very profound knowledge of many values. He could become intelligent without becoming intellectual. In the same thinking, the individual living in the confusion of times and confusion of situations can become intellectual without being intelligent. Intelligence has something of integrity about it. Intellectualism has merely self-justification and the eternal desire to prove that we are right without very much incentive to make sure that we are right. If then we find a life going outwardly, contrary to its inward needs, I think we have learned from long observation and experience that nature will not permit this disaster without making some effort to correct the situation. If there seems to be no way in which the person can receive the necessary instruction as the result of his own ability to interpret value, this instruction is pressed upon him from within himself in some symbolic form, in some way which it is hoped or believed he can understand or accept. Sometimes this pressure is so great that it breaks through even in the hours of waking. But as the hours of sleep are nearly always available and represent a minimum of resistance on the part of this badly oriented personality, it is most common for these important recommendations to be impressed upon us in the form of dream symbols. The subconscious of man is not a structure that is capable of molding forms with its own hand. It has no voice as we understand voice. It does not speak as we understand speech. It cannot impress itself directly upon us because of its own nature, which is essentially formless. We have no actual ability to behold the face of integration. We do not know what it looks like. But we do recognize that it can be communicated or in one way or another made somewhat evident to us by means of symbols. Actually, we have no ability to understand any abstraction unless this abstraction is closed, is put into a likeness or guise which is comprehensible. It is impossible for us to draw a picture of virtue. The only way we can understand it is by means of examples, and examples are a form of symbolism. We use the example to indicate the principle, and in education today, the example method is still one of the dominant ways of imparting new ideas. Even a formula remains comparatively meaningless until an example is provided. So in our dream or thought process, any important message must be conveyed to us by means of materials supplied by our own psyche. Now, the psyche, which it is important to reach with this impression, is the objective one. And the symbolism of objective man is derived from the objective world in which he lives. He derives his symbols from things or relationships or conduct patterns. And by these patterns, he seeks to communicate virtues of one kind or another. In the days of the early church, when most persons were illiterate and only the clergy could read the Bible, religious instruction was imparted by means of pictures. The walls of the churches and chapels and cathedrals were ornamented with scenes from the life of Christ. These were explained by the priest or the deacon and became, therefore, pictures of quality. These pictures were enlarged to include the parables and the principal admonitions of Jesus, and were further complicated or enlarged by the production of miracle plays on the porches or the broad squares before cathedrals. Here, dramatically, the lives of saints, the various moral virtues, the victory of good over evil, the story of the prodigal son, or the tale of the Good Samaritan, were enacted in order that the people might thus become aware through a simple symbol of the natures and substances of invisible virtues, which could not be directly traced of themselves. Thus, when some kind of abstract impulse is communicated from the archetypal psyche to the objective mind, there must be an adequate way of communication. Now, if we would assume that this subjective is a kind of ancient teacher, is the instructor, is the sage or the saint or the savior, the prophet, the priest, the philosophic physician, We can perhaps estimate what our reaction would be if some such a person should suddenly enter into our physical way of life. Supposing some very wise person made himself available to the needs of a very foolish man. The chances are the entire procedure would be utterly non-productive. The wise man would not be accepted by the foolish man. His wisdom would be regarded as old fogyish advice. He would be told that he belonged to a decadent generation, that the qualities which he tried to teach were old-fashioned and no longer applicable. That the only way to live would be the very way which was causing the trouble. Thus, the direct admonitional procedure would be of very little value unless it was accompanied by something by which it was distinguished, by which it was set apart from common experience, and in which something stronger than words became the basis of the communication of ideas. Sometimes, therefore, your archetypal image will impress itself in the form of a vision in which a person, usually a celestial or sublime being, suddenly appears as though in actual reality, communicates the instruction or gives the warning or the admonition, and then vanishes back into the mysterious abstract regions from which it came. The impact of such an experience, visual and audible, upon the lower personality is much more profound by the very mystery with which it is involved. Such a visitation, so-called, could not be taken lightly, and the course of history has frequently been changed by visions of this kind. Yet the admonition given in the vision was not something entirely unknown to the person who received it. It was an admonition subconsciously known, internally recognized to be true, but ignored or willfully forgotten by the ambitious person who did not wish to be limited by the dictates of his own conscience. Thus, the question as to whether this type of visitation represents the addition of knowledge or merely the revelation of the known, a new degree of impression from that which is eternally true. This is a situation of psychological significance. There is another point that I think is interesting in connection with this, namely the so-called warning or instructive admonition. We know perfectly well that if a truly enlightened person was to thoroughly estimate our conduct, or in some now devised impartial mechanism, some machine which impersonally accepted all the factors of our personality into an equation, that such a machine could theoretically give us a fairly concise statement of our probabilities in a given situation. Also, we know that had we the wisdom enough, we could foresee things that would likely arise. We could avoid difficulties that are practically inevitable because of the course we are following. Yet these things are not evident to us in our normal state. Thus, the admonitional or instructive vision or dream does not necessarily mean that a foreign or outside entity is instructing. It can well mean that a deeper and better part of ourselves is providing us with a larger measure of insight into the probabilities of our own conduct, than would be objectively possible. And because the universe is lawful, and because all conduct must have its consequences, there are many phases of prophecy which only represent recognition of cause and effect and their inevitable operation. New vitality, a new power with which to cope with illusion, or with which to achieve victory over error, which otherwise appears to be closing in upon him. The usual problem, then, is to recognize the dream as a symbolical group of symptoms which have to do with some phase of character or temperament. These symptoms most frequently express them as the result of a critical alignment of problem factors. Very often they will precede a crisis, and if they are not in some way regarded, the individual from then on falls immediately into a more desperate situation. The symbols used in such dreams are derived, as we mentioned last week, from a kind of vocabulary of natural figures, natural objects, which have certain interpretive overtones, objects with which we particularly associate values. These values arising from our mythology, our legendary, our lore, art, literature, or culture, and values which have become accepted as a language of value by ourselves. We can easily understand that the objective nature must reach as far as it can into the subjective to meet this impression pattern that is seeking to come through. The objective refines itself from things seen or tasted or smelt or touched to things which are overtones. It moves as far toward the abstract as it can, and the abstract moves as far downward toward the concrete as possible. And if we are fortunate, there is a meeting of these two, forming a bridge for the actual communication of the instruction, such as whatever it may be. So we will say that nearly anyone who is under psychic pressure of any kind is subject to these warnings, to these diagnostic aids, which are intended to make possible his rapid recognition of his own condition and to inspire him to a proper remedy. If man, from the very early part of his culture, had continued to remember this psychic factor in himself, had clung firmly to these dream symbols, had accepted the meaning of them more generally and more generously, the chances are there would be very little need for psychologists today. Each individual could interpret his own inner life. But because we have raced headlong past these tasks, because we have relegated most symbolism to a mythological and imaginary sphere, we have forgotten that symbolism is a continuing language, that the myths and legends that we have learned or have remembered are still the fabric for the communication of subjective impulse. We no longer literally accept the myth, but the myths themselves continue to form this alphabet of meaningful symbols for the communication of internal impulse. So I feel that it is quite proper and right to say that man does receive a kind of instruction, that he does have the right, upon request or in need, to achieve a closer sense of conscious identity with his own total existence, in order that all of himself may be available to the emergency that arises. If he does not take advantage of this right and privilege which he has in nature, then the fault lies largely with himself, and not with nature's intention, for nature wishes him to make the correction. It is his own audacity which causes him to refuse. So in the problem of this type of correction, it is obvious that the message bears a direct relationship to the personal need. And as persons interpreting myths and legends interpret them differently, so that even mythologists have no common mind on these things, so it is true that symbols have different meanings to different persons and at different times. But always there is a meaning, and that meaning is always in some way related to our own personal psychological pattern. So, taking this thinking, we know that in philosophy, for example, there has always been the recommendation that the individual in the presence of a serious decision should pause and reflect. Now, it is this peculiar pause which is the key to receptivity to the psychic impression. If the person who is about to make an important decision would stop for a moment, go by himself, relax and be still, and then very quietly put together the elements of his task, he would find that he has a skill that he did not suspect. That hasty decisions may have complicated a situation that could otherwise be reasonable. It is this pausing, this stopping, this letting go of the conscious objective machinery of the plot and the scheme and the strategy. It is the individual attempting to make all major decisions from composure rather than from emergency. Emergency does not permit the psychic self to be heard. Emergency forces continually greater objectivity. The individual, as the emergency progresses, must make his decisions from ever lower levels of his own intelligence, until in panic he makes the worst decision of all. Thus, the idea that the ancients had, that in grave moments men should go into the temple and pray, and ask the help of God in their decision, simply meant that they should go, be quiet, state their problem internally, or in words if it so pleased them, addressing these words to the highest concept of truth which they could conceive. And then they should be quiet, attentive, and receptive to the answer. Whether the answer was to come through the oracle, or whether the answer was assumed to appear miraculously in their private lives. But this very process of placing ourselves in a mood of expectant relaxation, a mood in which we resolve to permit an impression from some superior level of consciousness to be received into our objective nature. This pause, this moment of quietude, opened the door in many instances, allowing the subjective to tell us its larger decision, or to reveal to us more clearly the elaborate complexity of the undertaking with which we were concerned. This meditational, prayer-like mood had its own relationship or similarity to sleep, for it was merely a partial receptivity, perhaps disciplined by religion or philosophy. But it was certainly the individual learning to listen for some kind of an inner voice, some kind of an inner impression, which would intuitively enrich his decisions. If, as in the case of modern man, we have come to almost completely ignore the spiritual overtone of life, in which, while perhaps we may claim to believe, we make very slight practical use of our believing, it is evident that the machinery of the mystical experience would alter its appearance. And under the conditions of today, there is less and less likelihood of this experience occurring to us while we are in a waking conscious state. Never before has waking consciousness of man been more totally locked in phenomena. Never before have we been so continually plagued with external pressure. Nor has there ever been a time when our self-discipline was as poorly organized and developed. We are for the most part, lack the capacity to relax or to enter into a truly meditative relationship with life. We are not able, in the waking state, to achieve true receptivity of consciousness. We are continually battling, and what a time we might like to spend in such meditative procedure may be so frequently interrupted as to make the procedure comparatively valuable. And so at last, after the long and difficult day, we tumble into bed. And our first release from our own problem is unconsciousness. And sometimes we are even deprived of this blessing, continuing to toss and thrash through the night, trying to escape the intensities of habit mechanisms, which no longer permit us to rest even when the time is available. If, however, through physical or psychic fatigue, we actually go to sleep, we not only, for the first time, achieve a kind of relaxation, but never before in history has our psychic load been heavier. Not too long ago, the individual psychic load was mostly grave concern for the immediate and imminent circumstances of his personal existence. He went along very much a creature of habit. He did not expect unusual reward. He was not particularly discontented. He accepted a lot similar to that into which he had been born. And his main worries involved sickness or loss or accidents and things of that nature. He was not obsessed with world politics. He was not ready to collapse psychologically if the wrong candidate got in. He had none of these delightful measures that are burdening us even this fair evening. Actually, therefore, his psychic load was perhaps more religious than ours. His fear of sin was probably more acute than ours. His fear of nonconformity was more acute. But he was not in debt beyond control. He was not afraid to be sick because he could not pay the doctor's bill. He was not under the psychic pressure of intense mechanism. He was not jealous and envious to the degree that we are. And he did not come face to face with the tremendous conflict of powerful personalities that today are our normal lot. Thus his psychic load did not impose itself so directly upon him, nor did it demand such a crushing and crashing breakthrough as the one we bear today. As a result of this situation, we note that apparently the psychological sleep consciousness of man is more active now than ever before in our recorded history. This activity seems to mean that the person is more psychically stress-ridden than ever before, and that the insecurities of life are accumulating more rapidly than they used to. And where this situation is not met with some appropriate remedy, nervous breakdowns are almost certain, heart trouble is more frequent than it used to be, and in spite of our elaborate scientific discoveries and the ways in which we can now combat many ailments, the public health is not as good as it was 50 years ago. Length of life in some cases is greater, but it is merely an extended period of time for acute mental anguish. Therefore, there is some doubt as to the favor that we have enjoyed. Bearing all these factors a little bit in mind, we can see why many persons under a heavy psychic load should have disturbed rest. This disturbance is of several natures and kinds. Some people just simply can't seem to sleep at all. Others fitfully. Some have the sense of dreaming but do not remember the dream. And of those dreams that are remembered, more and more are ominous. More and more are unpleasant dreams. Dreams which do not have much in them of contentment. They are not the dream of the happy child to be found in some fairy tale. They are the dreams that come close to nightmares. Dreams in which man continues to experience the difficulty, perhaps intensified, by which his daily life is so unhappily punctuated. This also means that dreaming is sometimes a kind of safety valve. The individual, more or less symbolically, continues the lines of thought with which he was previously concerned. Interpretation of such dreams from a standpoint of instruction is simply to point out that the individual is under too continuous attention, that he is not able to disentangle himself sufficiently from his own